Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, based on where you are, and welcome to this panel on mass atrocities and statelessness, reconsidering the case of the Rohingya. My name is Amal Dichikera, and I'm the co-director of the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion, an organization that works on the right to nationality and statelessness around the world. And one of the main communities on whose behalf we do engage in operations are the Rohingya community. And I'm very delighted to be serving as moderator for this panel. We have four fantastic panelists, all different combinations of advocate, activist, and academic, and all with extensive expertise on the Rohingya issue. We will conduct this panel in quite an informal, dynamic way. We just have 1 hour to get through a lot. And no doubt the discussion is going to be extremely interesting and insightful. And so what I will do is I will initially ask each of my four panelists to come in with some opening comments. And then we will engage in a discussion amongst the panelists. And during this discussion, I will also start taking in questions from the audience and putting them to the panelists. So it's not going to be a traditional 4 speeches followed by questions type of session, but rather a much more dynamic one. And so I encourage all of you to submit any questions that you may have via the Q&A function on your Zoom panel. So my four panelists are Wei Wei Nu, Akhila Radhakrishnan, Regina Paulus, and Catherine Southwick, and I'm really delighted to be sharing this space with them. I will introduce each panelist in a little more detail as I invite them to take the floor. And first, I'm going to ask Wei Wei Nu to take the floor and to talk to us a little bit about the current situation in Myanmar. Wei Wei is someone I've known and admired for a number of years now. She herself is a former political prisoner from Myanmar and is the founder and executive director of the Women and Peace Network of Burma. She has dedicated herself to working on issues of democracy and human rights and peace building in Myanmar and for people from Myanmar. And she particularly has focused a lot on working on behalf of the Rohingya community to which she belongs. Wei Wei, I'm really happy to be able to share this space with you. And given what we've seen happening in Myanmar, for those of you who are less familiar with the situation in the country, there's been a coup that has happened in early February, and this has completely altered the political landscape in the country, and it has changed the situation in terms of what the possibilities may be for the Rohingya community, how the Rohingya community are viewed inside Myanmar, and also what the future may hold for them. So, Wei Wei, I would like to give you the floor as the Rohingya member of our panel and as an activist who's been working for many years on these issues, to reflect a little bit initially about the coup and what that means to the Rohingya community and where you see the future in this regard.
Thank you, Amal, for your kind introductions. Thank you um, for this opportunity to join you all today. So yes, I would just give you a bit of reflections, recap on what happens, and then reflections, I guess. So to set the tone, I guess we had this 10 years of political opening. I called it political opening, while many used to call it as political democratic transitions or democratizations. But I thought, yes, it was definitely some sort of liberalizations for the country, opening for the country since 2010 to until February 1st coup this year. And during that past, after 5 decades of military dictatorship since 1962, over the past 10 years, there was, yes, many people in Myanmar, especially in the urban area, in where ethnic Burmese majority resides, they have enjoyed some level of freedom, and some level of opportunities and prosperities, openness, in what is it means it look like when we talk about a free society. But when it's come to the ethnic minorities, we have this horrific. We have continued to suffer very serious human rights violations and horrific crimes, especially when it's come to the Rohingya. As you all know, the active genocide against the Rohingya occurred in 2016. It started from, I guess, 2012, and then actual mass crackdown and violations against the Rohingya occurred in 2016 and 17 under this political opening, under the name, the political system which we named as which the world called it as democracy. And again, it was under the civilian government in 2015 to 2000. I mean, it was civilian government before. In the first election period, it was the first civilian government was backed by the military, so we didn't count them that much. But since 2015 to 20, it was the National League for Democracy Party led civilian government, where the control over the majority of governance was held. So it was NLD government led by Aung San Suu Kyi. So now on February 1st, we were not actually expecting this level of this level of development, given knowing that the military, the political systems set up under the 2008 Constitution itself was already given so much space and power to the military, and and there has been some sort of engagement and relationship ongoing between the military and Aung San Suu Kyi NLD government. So we were not expecting this level of coup and severe crackdown against people. But now, we have been like for now over 7 weeks, and we are seeing increasing, escalating violence attack, deadly attacks against the civilian. And over 2,000 people have been arrested. Over 300 people have been killed over the past 7 weeks, and there has been, many other forms of abuses and brutalities against peaceful protesters, against members of civil disobedience movement, against politicians and everybody else there. Plus, internet shutdowns. Everything is ongoing right now. So everything has changed. The way we think, the way we see, everything has somehow changed, and there has been so many questions. The first questions came to us as members of Rohingya was like, whether are we going to support this democracy movement or not? Whether are we going to talk about the release of the Aung San Suu Kyi and the release of politicians or not? And there has been discussions and debate ongoing among the Rohingya themselves. And the opinion, the perspective, and the positions are varied from places to places or person to person. But majority of us choose to support democracy movement, choose to stand against the military dictatorship, choose to stand for the people of the country. And I personally think we should also stand for the release of the Aung San Suu Kyi or other political prisoners. Although she was the one denying the genocide against my people. But I think it is the right thing for now. I mean, the right thing for us to do what is right and to stand on the justice, regardless of who they are, even if they are our enemy. Keeping in mind that even if they are our enemy, we have to be strong and we have to stick with the principle and stand with it. So now that is what we are doing. Last thing that I think I would like to mention here is that you are seeing people posting about some Burmese people and protesters saying that we regret the way we have treated the Rohingya, and now we sympathize them. And we are seeing a lot of them among the younger generation. that is true. And that is very, very positive sign. And people started to realize if this level of brutality could happen on the city, in main cities, where so many eyes and so many cameras are there, if this could happen in main cities, and they now can imagine it could be worse in places like in Rakhine State. So, through this process, they started to empathize and realize there was something wrong, and there has been acknowledgement, and it's been very, very encouraging and empowering. However, I have not seen any genuine change and genuine engagement or genuine communication from the leaders in Myanmar, especially the NLD leaderships, including CRPH and Burmese, Burman, ethnic Burman political leaders. I have not seen any genuine effort yet. I'm cautiously optimistic, and I'm gonna be saying it out loud because it is something that we have to always, keep in mind as we respond to this crisis, as well as the world is going to support Burmese democracy movement. So I'm going to stop here. I'll be happy to discuss further later.
Thank you so much, David, for setting the scene so clearly and for pulling at some of the complexities and nuances and even contradictions within the situation. And know that these are questions that we can and should come back to when we open up the floor for further discussion. I think some of the points that you made regarding the atrocities that are being committed against members of the democracy movement right now and the civil disobedience movement, and connecting that to past actions of the military towards the Rohingya and other minorities, it's very important. And that, of course, relates very much to the focus of this session, which is on mass atrocities and statelessness. And just to remind members of our audience, the Rohingya are probably the largest stateless community in the world. However, statelessness is not a term that sits well with the Rohingya community. And I think it's more important to talk about the Rohingya situation as one where they have been arbitrarily deprived of their nationality. The Rohingya have a right to Myanmar nationality, and their statelessness is a direct result of a deprivation of that right. And so a lot of our focus in this session also has to be on the question of nationality deprivation and statelessness and how that relates to mass atrocities. And in that context, I'm delighted to bring our second panelist into the conversation, Dr. Catherine Southwick, who again I have had the privilege of working with and knowing for a number of years. Catherine has researched the fields of statelessness and atrocity prevention for a number of years, and therefore she's the perfect candidate for this panel. She's worked in the US, East Africa, India, and the Philippines, and she's currently serving as a consultant with the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. She has been working on the Rohingya issue since around 2013, and she completed a PhD at the National University of Singapore. Catherine, so if I can give you the floor now and ask you to maybe elaborate on this connection between citizenship stripping and statelessness on the one hand, and atrocity prevention on the other, and maybe push you a little further to also reflect on if citizenship stripping is relevant to atrocity prevention, is the restoration of nationality relevant to the whole process of justice in the context of atrocities having been committed? Catherine.
Thank you, Amal. I think the straightforward answer to the question is, in my view, is that statelessness is a very important and strong indicator of atrocity risk, and is therefore an important factor when we're talking about mitigation of atrocities. But the Rohingya case raises the question of whether statelessness is nonetheless adequately identified as such a risk factor in the context of atrocity prevention research and practice. But as with any risk factor or warning sign, the degree to which statelessness is a risk varies by context and the presence of a relationship with other factors and circumstances. But when we're talking about statelessness and mass atrocities, as I was trying to reflect on this, the fact is there's not a whole lot of legal guidance, but we may have more scholarly and policy guidance. And so the Rohingya case is for us, I think, a key source for understanding better this relationship or a relationship between statelessness and mass atrocities. And with the ICJ case that was launched by Gambia against Myanmar for alleging breach of the Genocide Convention, statelessness is playing a role in giving some shape to this very ill-defined norm of genocide prevention. So how does statelessness relate to atrocity risk? Most situations of statelessness are involuntary, and many of those situations involve the targeting of a group based on their identity in some regard. This can form part of the context in identifying possible crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, such as persecution or apartheid, and even perhaps certain war crimes. The Rohingya are a prominent example. Also, a historic example, of course, are the Jews of Nazi Germany, who were stripped of citizenship under the Nuremberg laws of 1935, which then provided a legal foundation for further persecution and eventual extermination in the Holocaust. We have more recent examples of group-based denial of citizenship, such as persons of Haitian descent in the Dominican Republic, Nubians in Kenya, the Bedouin in Kuwait, and the Urdu-speaking minority in Bangladesh, among others. So when statelessness arises in the context of group tension, division, or inequality, which is often, it becomes relevant for understanding and mitigating risk. And much of the literature in genocide studies would mention statelessness or denationalization as an indicator among sort of the political or sociological stages that can lead to genocide. But interestingly, risk assessment frameworks that I reviewed, not exhaustively, generally don't explicitly mention statelessness. But you could well imagine that it's sort of implicitly covered under sort of the risk factors that are commonly cited, such as patterns of discrimination against protected groups, or record of human rights violations, exclusionary ideologies and policies, polarization, the situations of armed conflict and political instability, and of course, the absence of mitigating factors such as legitimate and inclusive governance structures. But statelessness and citizenship stripping is, in some cases, I think, central to creating a discriminatory, exclusionary environment that can enable the commission of human rights violations and atrocities. The Jacob Blaustein Institute has one framework, cites the widespread or systematic denial of the right to nationality as the first of 21 human rights-related risk factors of genocide. As they note, citizenship is typically the basis for enjoying the state's full protection of the rights to establish residence and move freely, to vote and participate in public life, to access health services, higher education, work, and rent own property. And in the case of the Rohingya, we see very clearly that all of these rights were effectively lost as a result of statelessness. And in 2015, the government passed these so-called race and religion laws, which restricted marriage and birth rates. And it's well understood that denial of citizenship substantially increased the vulnerability and further stigmatization toward the group within wider society, inside and outside Myanmar. I also want to point, though, to cases where statelessness is not like a precursor, but is the conclusion of a process of conflict. The 82 citizenship law in Myanmar, which many recognize as is the vehicle through which the Rohingya were stripped of citizenship, came about following large-scale violence in the late 70s. And other examples include the breakup of Yugoslavia, denationalization of Eritreans in Ethiopia during the border conflict in the 90s, and the statelessness of the Urdu-speaking minority after Bangladesh's War of Independence. It's important to show that statelessness is a consequence of atrocities and risk, and that statelessness then can launch another cycle of protracted vulnerability and atrocity risk and human rights abuse that we see in the case of Myanmar becomes corrosive to sort of general legal and political structures. So I'm not going to go on too long, but just to emphasize that I think in this sort of preliminary consideration of the question, statelessness should be more prominently featured in understanding mass atrocity risk because it is such a powerful tool for creating that polarized environment that increases risk, and because it imposes such long-term risk and generational damage on vulnerable populations. Moreover, just a last point, to the extent that statelessness forms part of the context of atrocity risk, then restoring and protecting nationality rights is, of course, a key part of prevention, and is therefore, under the Genocide Convention, a duty held by all states parties to the convention. And I think that's important to point out as in terms of just sort of raising the prominence of resolving statelessness as an obligation that may be implicated under the Genocide Convention, which is so widely ratified. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for bringing in the angle of atrocity prevention, and in this context, genocide prevention, and the relationship that statelessness has with the build-up to mass atrocities in many ways. Our work at the Institute, it has shown us the huge connection between minority rights and statelessness. Over 75% of stateless people in the world belong to minority communities. And that's no accident. It's because there's a larger push to exclude certain communities. And this is not it's both to make it easier for their rights to be denied, but it's also to build a narrative that they do not belong and therefore they do not deserve rights. The Genocide Convention is both about prevention, but also about punishment. And in that context, it's my pleasure to bring in Akila Radhakrishnan, who's our third panelist. Akila is the president of the Global Justice Center, and she's worked with a particular focus on gender equality and human rights at GLC. And she has led to the development of groundbreaking legal work on abortion access in conflict and the role that genocide plays the role that gender plays in the context of genocide. Akila, it's great to have you on the panel and to have you follow on what Weiwei and Catherine so elegantly kind of laid out for us. And I'd like you to bring you in on this question of punishment and accountability and justice, and maybe ask you to look at the ICC and the ICJ processes, so the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice processes, and reflect perhaps on the implications that the coup may have in terms of these and other processes. Does this change things? Does it make them more complicated? And what do you see happening going forward?
Thanks so much, Amal, for the intro. And it's such a delight to be here on these panelists and with all of you. So, I think I'll start with kind of focusing on three things because there's a lot in there. So first, I think is just, in this context, Weiwei so powerfully laid out the longer history that we're talking about here. So we're talking about a history of commission of international crimes, genocide in the context of the Rohingya, war crimes and crimes against humanity against a large subset of ethnic minorities in Burma for the last 60 years. And so where we're at now is, as we talk about the coup, we're talking about a military that has committed these atrocities, that has fully been enshrined by a culture of impunity, now are back in charge of the country. And so to me, that's the first inquiry that we really need to be thinking about when we start this conversation on justice, is the role that impunity played in getting us to where we're at today. And the importance then, I think, of accountability as a part of this bigger picture solution, not just to the immediate crisis in Myanmar, not just to kind of the situation specifically of the Rohingya, but as a foundation for a sustainable and just Burma, right? There is a longer term consideration there. So I think that's really where that informs my thinking. We're an organization that's been working with ethnic women's groups in Myanmar since 2005. on calls for justice and accountability, particularly for sexual violence committed by the military. And so it's this long arc that I think we have to be thinking about as we think of what are the current processes and where do we need to go. So you outlined and mentioned that finally, finally after decades of impunity, you started to see in 2019 a few glimmers of hope in the accountability space as it related to Burma. And most of them were coming out of the Rohingya genocide, which Wei Wei has talked about, and Catherine has really laid the groundwork for, the history of exclusion that really underlies what was going on there. So, after decades of demands from a range of ethnic groups, including the Rohingya, for justice and accountability, you saw in 2019, there was a 3-day period in November 2019 that I remember where you actually had the Gambia institute a case against Myanmar at the International Court of Justice. You had the ICC authorize the opening of an investigation into certain crimes that were committed that spilled over into Bangladesh. And you actually also had the filing of a universal jurisdiction case in Argentina as well. And so there was this kind of moment of hope in November, December 2019. It really felt like we were on a pathway of some sort of shift. I mean, Wei Wei, you and I were in The Hague together in December 2019, and it was there was hope. And so I think that we shouldn't lose that hope as we think about what justice and accountability means now. So just really briefly in terms of those ongoing processes. So first, the ICJ case was filed under the Genocide Convention, as Catherine mentioned, by the Gambia against Myanmar. It seeks to hold them accountable for their failures to prevent and punish genocide. And very importantly, as a part of this process, in January 2020, that's right, time has been a weird thing over the last year. In January 2020, the International Court of Justice issued provisional measures, kind of specifically ordering the government to take action, to prevent any further acts of genocide against the Rohingya. And those provisional measures continue through today. So two things I'll note about the ICJ case. One, and I think this goes to what Wei Wei was talking about, is it was vigorously defended not just by the military, but by the NLD and the civilian government of the country. They denied that a genocide had occurred. They made some arguments that perhaps some soldiers had acted, in a slightly out of control kind of manner. That's all they would admit to. And there was a real clear indication that the civilian government was going to continue to deny that the genocide happened and inhibit these types of accountability efforts, right? So I think that is important context too, as we think about the future of accountability for the country and who's in charge of the country and what positions they take, because it's easy in some contexts to just blame the military, but the history, and particularly for the Rohingya, is far more complicated. So that's one thing I think to note about the ICJ case. The other thing to note about the ICJ case is that one of the provisional measures is an ongoing mandate to actually report every 6 months back to the court about the measures that Myanmar is taking to comply with the provisional measures that have been ordered. And the Gambia has the ability to also comment on these measures as they are to the court. Now, pre-coup, the reports aren't public, but the government had taken some very superficial actions to say that they were complying, but nothing really was being met, and it was clear that the Rohingya were deeply unsatisfied with what the government had done to comply thus far. It'll be interesting to see in this context if the military government actually submits a report in May of this year, which is when the next report is due, and it'll be interesting to see kind of if there's any shifts in representation or other aspects. I'm happy to get into these a little bit more during Q&A if people want to talk about it. And then in the context of the ICC, again, really briefly, Myanmar is not a party to the Rome Statute, just like the United States is not a party to the Rome Statute. But the Office of the Prosecutor made the argument and have, been granted at least the ability to open an investigation that certain crimes that happened in Rakhine State against the Rohingya, including forced displacement and other inhumane acts, are ones that had a necessary component in the state of Bangladesh, who is a state party. And so there you have a limited opening for individual criminal accountability because, of course, the ICJ is concerned with the responsibility of Burma as a state. And so, you have this very small sliver of crimes that happen against the Rohingya that possibly could be prosecuted at the ICC, and that investigation is ongoing. So, quickly to wrap up here, I think where do we need to go from here? I think there's three things that we need to see. One, we need to be bolstering these larger efforts for individual criminal accountability. There is a strong call at this moment for a referral to the ICC for the country. And I think that's a really important one because it not only could open up the possibility of the full range of crimes committed against the Rohingya, it could open up the possibility of prosecuting the full range of crimes against other ethnic groups that have been well documented by the UN and is a really necessary precursor for the democracy in the country. And it actually could open up the possibility of accountability for the crimes that are being committed by the military in the context of the coup. And so, we need to be thinking about how to broaden and bring everyone under this accountability picture. So I think I'll stop there and then we can follow up on any of these in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Akila, for expertly taking us through some very complex international legal processes and also for touching on some of the dynamics. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the problematic role that the NLD has played in the context of the ICJ case, it does complicate the question in terms of looking at what will happen going forward. I would like to now turn our attention to our fourth and final speaker, Regina Paulus, who's an international criminal lawyer based in the US, and she is an editor and contributor of the soon-to-be published volume by Vernon Press entitled Green Crimes and International Criminal Law. So, flowing on Akila's intervention, and a couple of things that you said, and also which Weiwei alluded to. So Weiwei's questioning of the fact that what happened in Myanmar over the last 10 years was labeled as democratization, when actually that was perhaps much too big a word to use. And Akila, what you said in terms of the impunity of the military. And so my question to Regina is around the role of the international community in ASEAN, the Western world, the Security Council, which has been completely hamstrung, and to what extent they have contributed towards this impunity and towards this the manner in which the Myanmar military in particular has been allowed to get away with its crimes. And also what role you see for them going forward and what needs to change.
Thank you, Amal, and it's really nice to be on a panel like this with a lot of diverse perspectives. So what I'm going to do in the short amount of time I have, because I do want to get to the Q&A, is talk about three specific institutions, and that's the UN Security Council, ASEAN, and SARC. And I'll mention what SARC is at the end. I'm just only going to be able to scratch the surface. But for the UN Security Council, I mention it first, not because it's the most important, but because it is the one that's easiest to talk about when it comes to this issue. They have never, so far at least, and there is an opening, and I'll talk about that in a second, that could potentially happen. They have never made a bold statement with regards to the Rohingya genocide. And I think at this point in time, one of the things that we have to always remember, and one of the things that I see based on my experience, is that a lot of people have this idealism about the UN Security Council, and they also have this wish list that they think the UN Security Council can do, but in fact, it doesn't actually meet what they can do as an entity, and nor what they can do under the Charter. Really, where a lot of these things play into is the Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly. And today, for instance, we saw the UN Special Rapporteur on Myanmar stand up and say, it's time for a summit, let's get everybody together. These are the kinds of movements that we need to be seeing. And I think for people to pin their hopes on the UN Security Council all the time isn't really going to get us to where we want to go, because they haven't been strong on the Rohingya issue. Now, with that in mind, the glimmer of hope comes from the fact that the council has negotiated a presidential statement with the U.S. sitting as the president of the council this month on Myanmar, on Burma. and they were able to come up with one. And I think what we have to keep in mind is the context of what is going on at the UN Security Council. I suspect with my whole heart and soul that it is China and Russia that toed the line for the Burmese government, whoever that looks like. I agree with Weiwei that word democracy is too big of a word, right? It's really whoever's dressed up as the leader at the time. And Aung San Suu Kyi herself was the one to say that this is an internal matter, that the Rohingya matter is an internal matter. So as long as that line continues among the UN Security Council, there really isn't that kind of push to get it beyond the reach where it can say it's an international issue. And I think that's where we're starting to see maybe some of that crumbling now, that maybe that's not really the way it can go and it has to go. So that's the UN Security Council. I look forward to seeing what the Special Rapporteur is going to do in terms of getting the summit together and seeing if that will be successful. In terms of Asia, before I get into ASEAN and SAARC, what I want to mention is two things that I think are relevant both to the work of both what Amal and Catherine have alluded to, is that Asia in general, I think when it comes to these issues of citizenship, and when it comes to the issue of religious freedom, which is also an important issue for the Rohingya, they're not strong. The continent is not strong on these issues. So denaturalization and all these kinds of things. And we see that in different parts of Asia. We see that with responses to other minority groups that are experiencing genocide. And especially among the Rohingya community, people tend to think that it is only a Muslim community. It is also it is a diverse community. There's Hindus, there's Christians, there's a lot of diversity in the community as well. And so religious freedom is really an important facet of that. And all over Burma, we're seeing that, other ethnic groups are facing problems with religious freedom. And one of the reasons why they're being persecuted, because they don't fit into this concept of Burmanization, which is exactly what the military's line has been for so long. So ASEAN, what is the role that they can play? Well, ASEAN, frankly speaking, who is the leader of ASEAN? That's the question we really have to ask ourselves. And who is the voice in ASEAN? Burma is a part of ASEAN, of course. And ASEAN, the last time they tried to do something for the Rohingya, they went right into the camps and told them, how about these national verification cards, which the Rohingya turned around and said, no, thank you. And so now that's it. And so what I think we have to keep in mind, though, and my concern is always for the Rohingya is that if we weren't using this word genocide, if we weren't using crimes against humanity, what would we be really doing to help the Rohingya? And I think we have to constantly think of ways to address all crimes that are happening, as Akila mentioned, genocide and crimes against humanity among them. But human trafficking, for instance, is one of those crimes that has been constantly reported in the Trafficking in Persons report. Drug trafficking is another thing that the Rohingya community faces, used constantly as mules for the Tatmadaw, and as victims as both of those crimes, human smuggling. And one of the things that I'll mention is that ASEAN and Burma signed on to this as a convention on human trafficking. The American Bar Association last summer sent a letter to Malaysia reminding them the fact that they signed this convention and that they have to help the Rohingya when the boats are trying to dock onto their territories because they committed to stopping and ending human trafficking. And so there are other ways for us to engage these players and to get them all onto the same page. But the last player I want to talk about is one that is often not discussed enough, and that's SAARC. And I usually forget what it stands for, but it's a South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. And SAARC, the players in SAARC are an interesting group. It's India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. These are the South Asian countries. But the reason why I mentioned them is specifically because these are the receiving countries of Rohingya refugees. And we're seeing today, for instance, Prashant, the Supreme Court lawyer who went to the Supreme Court today in India, and that case is being heard by the Supreme Court. We'll have a decision soon on whether or not it was legal what they're doing to the Rohingya in Kashmir. So these kinds of actions are being taken, but these countries, I think, have a role to play in dealing with the Tatmadaw because they always have. For Asia, I don't know if it's really ever mattered who's sitting, whether it's the Tatmadaw or Aung San Suu Kyi. It's been business, and they've continued to have these relationships with the government. So the question really has to be for us is how can we leverage their relationships in order to get change for the Rohingya? And I think if these governments were to take an active leadership role, we can see some positive developments because we can't forget that besides the refugees that are in India, Bangladesh, Malaysia, there's a ton of other places that they are, but there's people internally displaced within Burma. We have landmine issues that are preventing a lot of people from even moving freely, the marriage restrictions, all sorts of things that these countries can take a leadership role on, and maybe not so much have to worry about Western influence or spies or whatever line the Chinese and the Russians are kind of going for. So with that, I'm going to close and hand it back to you, Amal.
Thank you so much, Regina, for bringing in that regional dimension and also reflecting on the role or the lack of a role played by the Security Council. I must say, as a Sri Lankan citizen, the mention of SARC brought a smile to my face because I haven't seen SARC do anything or organize to kind of do anything on any issue for as long as I've been alive. But you're absolutely right in that the Rohingya issue is very relevant to SARC countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh in particular. So the Kashmir events that Regina spoke of or referred to, this is basically action by Indian authorities to round up and detain Rohingya refugees in India, in Kashmir, and to threaten to deport them back to Myanmar. Remember, Myanmar is a country currently facing a coup, and Myanmar is also the country which is accused of committing war crimes and genocide against Rohingya. So the idea that India would seriously consider deporting Rohingya to Myanmar, and India has done so in the past as well, is deeply concerning. So we have around 20 minutes now, and I thank all the panelists again for such a rich set of interventions. And let me just take a pause a moment to encourage audience members to please share in any questions that you may have for the panelists, and I would then put them to the panelists. But I would also like to open out the discussion amongst the panelists themselves to see if any of you would like to respond to or react to or comment on some of the comments made by fellow panelists. Let me just get the ball rolling by putting Weiwei on the spot and asking you to reflect a bit on what you heard from Catherine and Akila and Regina, looking at regional diplomatic and legal atrocity prevention and international criminal interventions or the possibilities of such interventions. And what I would like to ask you to do is assess all of these possibilities that are happening right up there at the international level and compare that to what's happening on the ground in Myanmar. And how do we bridge the gap between those two? Do you see a connection between them?
Sure. I think, thank you for the flexibility. I guess I'm gonna rule out here anything that I want at this point. In my opinion, I think it is crucial for us to focus on the root cause, and whether at the Security Council or at or in other justice processes, or in overall in advocacy, it is crucial to focus on the root causes. It is crucial to focus on the accountability and criminal accountability, broader accountability and criminal accountability, and that is that should be our primary objective. At the same time, because the Rohingya continue to suffer everywhere, not only in Rakhine, but in Bangladesh, we have people died, yesterday, the day before yesterday, with thousands of people are missing. And, because of this fire, and where the Bangladesh put camps, fences around the refugee camps, when when fire happened and people had no place to escape, they cannot escape because of the fences, so they died consequently, and people dying on Andaman Sea, and people being arrested in India, people being trafficked and abused and arrested, face many other challenges in Malaysia, and the list goes on. And it continue to suffer everywhere they go, because we are unable to address the root causes. Root causes that has to be addressed. We are unable to address. We are not putting enough effort as advocate or as international community, international, or whoever stakeholder, all of us, and the states are unwilling to take responsibility or to hold the military or Burmese government accountable at the Security Council or by the governments. So thus, to end all bigger crisis, human tragedy of these populations, we need to have a focus on the addressing root causes. On the other hand, for these immediate situations in whether crimes, continuations of crimes in Rakhine State or in Bangladesh, we also have to approach within the domestic and regional framework, or within the domestic systems, or legal systems, or regional protections mechanisms available as such human trafficking. And we're not touching, I guess, what I'm observing is we don't have enough capacity or attentions or I guess advocacy ongoing for it comprehensively, at the local level, at the regional level, as well as global level. I mean, global level, there are so much attentions, and of course, I don't know whether we've been effective or not, but there has been attentions and work ongoing. But on the ground level, there aren't enough. There aren't much. So I think I agree with Regina on that front. It is important that we understand what protections mechanisms available on the ground, in those countries or as a regions, and what resources we can mobilize and push for the protections on the ground as well. And I agree with that. On the going back to Myanmar, I think it is very, very for us. How do I put this one here? So right now, my frustration is that we have this democratization movement, and people are we are very drawn to it. We have this anti-coup movement ongoing, and we feel obliged to support it. And a lot of us feel, as Burmese or non-Burmese, right, feel that way. And there are people also wanted to support anti-coup movement because it's popular, and everybody want to get on the cruise, whether without knowing that whether the cruise or the boat is going to sink or not, right? But I think if we're not going to pay attention to what is happening and not fix from the beginning, if we don't take a cautious approach, and if we don't try to address some of the problem that we're seeing, such whether these support, who are we supporting? Are these people are really? What if they continue to be complicit in genocide? Right? Are we going to ask them these questions enough? And I think when it comes to Myanmar and at the current moment, it is crucial that we pay attention to that area. But again, on the international level, I absolutely agree that we need to work on in different countries with the different stakeholders. At the same time, we should pay attention and focus to the root causes, addressing root causes and accountability.
Thank you, Bebe. And
sorry for very long answer.
No, it's very important to have you take the time to lay these out, because they're very complicated issues. We've just got a question in from the audience, which I'm going to take myself. So it's on whether the 1951 Refugee Convention can be of help in this situation. And the challenge we have here is that all of the countries in which you have large Rohingya refugee populations are not party to the 51 Convention. So whether it's Bangladesh or India or Malaysia or Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. And so it doesn't directly apply in that context. And you have in all of these countries, actually, the Rohingya being, barring a few minor exceptions, the Rohingya being viewed and treated as irregular migrants and therefore being criminalized rather than being protected. I'm going to hand the floor to Catherine, who wanted to come in with a comment. Yes, over to you, Catherine.
Yes, I just wanted to reinforce what Weiwei was saying. I think she's absolutely right. Just speaking as an observer about the in the when we're trying to envision what comes next, one hopes that this democracy movement is successful somehow, as sooner than later. But that the notion of the democracy movement, what is so sort of unique about it, as Weiwei had discussed, was that there is a realization of the need to stop these politics of exclusion, and that the way to sort of oppose the military effectively is for the different groups to unite. And there seems to be in some places a real shift in consciousness that one couldn't have imagined a couple of years ago with respect to accepting the Rohingya as part of the Myanmar citizenry. And so I think because the Rohingya's effective statelessness has been such a central part of their exclusion and persecution and displacement, it's absolutely crucial and appropriate and normal in transitions for a new political, whether arrangement or constitution or interim setup, to make provisions for equal citizenship. And so that again, this kind of goes back to my earlier point. The idea of citizenship as a risk factor, and inclusive equal citizenship as a risk, the lack of it as a risk factor, is sort of central to sort of building a democratic state. So, I would hate to see the international community sort of make the mistake that it made, 10 years ago, which was to accept democracy alongside, genocide. I mean, that's just not a democracy. And so that's just sort of, a discourse that needs, I think, to be really reinforced and strengthened. And there are elements that, within the domestic movement that are very, resonant with those ideas. So the other point I would say is that the more that the domestic movement can signal acceptance of Rohingya and inclusion of Rohingya as citizens, and start to even make provision for that in some kind of transition at some point, that also takes pressure off of the region, so that the region is less afraid, perhaps. This has always been a dynamic. They always worry that if we start being too nice to the Rohingya, that it'll be a pull factor. But if the situation domestically starts to improve and show promise, that may lessen the reluctance of regional actors to be helpful to Rohingya who are still stranded outside the country. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Catherine. And that's such an obvious point when you put it that way, that genocide and democracy simply don't go hand in hand. And it's tragic that we have to keep on emphasizing this point. Akila, you wanted to come in, didn't you?
Yeah, and I think this really just reinforces the points that Weiwei and Catherine are making, and particularly, Weiwei's point around root causes. When we think about the last 10 years, we're talking about a democracy that was built on an entirely flawed structure of ethnic inclusion, of discrimination. And so it's one that I think we have to think very carefully about, and what the role of the international community is pushing forward for this. Because Catherine was right. They ignored not just genocide, they ignored the fact there was ongoing conflict and a peace process that was stalled, that did not look like it was going to be resolved, period. Right? There was not, and a part of that was because the ethnic groups had called for a federalized country. And I think so it's really important that as we think about what these new openings potentially represent, continuing to call the international community to account, to not fall back on their kind of, the old practices, the ability to rely on, say, NLD leadership. And I think the other thing that I want to highlight here in terms of that is, Catherine, you mentioned the calls from the ground are so much more inclusive, but there remains a division between, I think, what you see in the civil disobedience movement as such, the more of the protest movement in the streets, which is much more inclusive, which is much more diverse in their calls, in their inclusion, than what's emerging as the political leadership of the country under the CRPH. And the CRPH, represents, I think, to many, as did NLD, 10 years ago, the only hope for, let's say, a future of a democratic Burma, right? There's this sense that we have to engage with the CRPH because they are the only ones that represent the future. But they have not fully embraced this inclusive approach that is being demonstrated by those who are on the streets, the ones who are really showing up and, who are saying, we apologize for what happened to the Rohingya. We see now how we need to build a future that is inclusive, that recognizes their rights. And so I think that the international community needs to really use their voice strongly and loudly to be pushing, not, to not just be condemning the military, but actually be using their influence and power to be pushing the CRPH to be inclusive, to lay out on the table that the future that they support is one that is this federal multi-ethnic Burma that brings in accountability, because otherwise you just have leadership that looks just like previous NLD leadership, because that's who they are, minus maybe some people who are currently in detention. So I wanted to tease that out a little bit too, because I think that's one of the tricky dynamics of the moment and is going to be one of the challenges, is the ease with which everyone is going to want to fall back into previous practices and establish the status quo as it was on January 31st, which was not a good status quo for the Rohingya ethnic minorities and many others as well in the country.
Thank you, Akila. And I think that's a really important point. And if I may draw a parallel with US politics, I mean, it's very different situations, but I mean, the idea of going back to normal post-Trump and the gap that you see between progressive activism on the streets of America and the institutionalized mainstream political discourse. And it's a similar kind of dynamic in Myanmar, but of course in much more dramatic circumstances even than the US. I think it's fascinating for me, at least, to be part of a panel where the topic is mass atrocities and statelessness. And we spent a lot of the time talking about democratization and minority rights and activism. And to me, this shows actually how you cannot really be talking about statelessness and deprivation of rights, which are often an act to exclude people from democratic participation, without talking about democratization and progress and looking to the future. And we need to be mindful of both sides of this story, I think. And given that we have just over 2 minutes before this panel is going to come to a close, what I'm going to ask each panelist to do is I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to, in 30 seconds, tell me what you think the future holds for the Rohingya in Myanmar going forward. And I'm going to do this in reverse order, so starting with Regina and then working my way back to Weiwei. Over to you, Regina.
Thank you, Amal. I would say that I am going to stay very optimistic that the Rohingya are going to get they're going to get to go back home where they've always been and where they belong, and that they are going to be recognized nationals of Burma. And I'm not going to falter from that line no matter what the situation looks like. So Weiwei, you all have done a really great job, and you should really know that there's a lot of people who support you all, and to see you go back home and to have that peace of mind.
Thank you, Regina. Akila.
I think I'll continue the positivity. I think I would love to go beyond and say it's not just about the Rohingya going home. Their safe voluntary return has to be a priority. But I would love to see Rohingya and ethnic voices centered in the democracy and in the future of the country, put into positions of political leadership. So it's not just about a group that is allowed to exist in Burma, but actually a group that is thriving and leading the future for the country.
Thank you, Akila. Catherine.
I want to say, agree with what others have said. And I believe that more than I've ever seen in the time that I've looked at this situation, there are more elements that show promise than have existed before. But I think it really depends on how quickly, coordinatedly, and pointedly the international community and the domestic movement work together to accomplish the aims of the movement. The longer things go on, the more likelihood there is that things can unravel and lead to a darker scenario. So it very much depends on what everyone does to support what's happening and to ensure that these ideas of equality and equal access to citizenship and sort of restorative justice are front and center to the political structure moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. And Wei, last word to you, 30 seconds, what do you see the future holding?
I agree with all these amazing ladies, and I just want to add a few things. First, I think it is a must, regardless of who have coup or not, to pay attention to the protections of Rohingya in Rakhine and elsewhere, and to make sure Rohingya are able to return home safely, voluntarily, and to the places of origin. And second, I also have a visions that, hope that the Burmese current democracy movement will integrate Rohingya into the movement and really work to build in meaningful engagement and communication with Rohingya and all other ethnic communities. And lastly, it can only be happen when international community has actually, hold the Burmese leadership accountable. While I have so much faith on the people on the ground, on the younger generations, I am quite skeptical on the leadership yet. So it is a must. At the same time, international community to be very careful not to isolate Rohingya issue as a separate issue, aside from the Burmese democratizations. That's what they have been doing. And that is not being helpful. Now it's time to reflect for the entire world how to reset your strategy, how to, come up with an innovative and renovative strategy in response to the Burma democracy movement and ending atrocity crimes in Myanmar.
Thank you so much, Wei. There's so much work to be done. But there's also, as all four of you so eloquently put, there's so much to hope for, and seeing strong leaders like you, Wei, and seeing wonderful allies that the Rohingya community has, like my other fellow panelists, I too can hope that the future will bring better things, both for Myanmar and for the Rohingya. We've gone over time by a couple of minutes, but thank you so much, everyone, for joining this panel. And I hope that it has been as insightful and interesting and educative for you as it has been for me. Thank you, panelists. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.